Okay. Thank you, Niroshi, and good evening to everyone. Good afternoon to everyone. Just to kind of tell you, like we are having the CS Sri Lanka having the first regional conference today in Galle. So I'm joining with you from Galle. This is another initiative that CS Sri Lanka Member Relations Committee and the CS Sri Lanka management has started to enrich your knowledge on practice management, basically to share experience of different expertise in different disciplines. So our today's session, the third session, we will focus on the IS audit or the IT advisory side, where we will try to share certain practical insight, how SMPs can structure or strategize or take initiatives to cover up their requirements for IS audit and a little bit of advisory. Because, you know, like nowadays, when you go for audit, you will see most of the places you will have at least a simple accounting system where auditing standards requires you to check the controls behind those IT system, which will provide financial information, because at the end of the day, your audit opinion is for the financial statements. So I believe this session will help you to gather more practical insights or to clear up your doubts on certain areas about application of IS audit into your financial statement audit purpose, and also to a little bit of advisory side, which is a kind of opportunity for SMPs to capitalize to grow the business. So without taking much time, our today's presenter, none other than the Deputy Managing Partner of BDO Partners Sri Lanka, and he also the Head of Risk Advisory, including IT and Forensic, and also a Council Member of CS Sri Lanka. I warmly invite Ashane Jayasekar, our presenter today, to take us through the session today. Ashane?
Yeah, can you hear me, Gerard?
Yeah, Ashane, you're audible.
Can you see me? I've switched on the video, but...
I can see you, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Right, fine, thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Gerard, for that very kind introduction. And today I will speak to you on the topic of information systems audit. And hopefully within the next 45 minutes or so, I will speak on what an information systems audit is, the purpose of an information systems audit, why we generally carry out an IS audit. And also we will look at the different types of IS audit, various types, which I will touch on. And also I will cover the standards, give you a very brief overview of the standards that are out there, which one should follow when carrying out IS audits. I will also touch on, if time permits, the information systems risk-based methodology, which we all need to be aware of in carrying out IS audits. And also at the end, I will speak to you for a few minutes on how to carry out an ITGC, which is an information technology general controls review. So we all know that given the advances in technology that is happening out there, for example, with the onset of fourth generation technologies like big data, robotics, process automation, data mining, Internet of Things, etc. The threat landscape has evolved greatly in the past few years. So as an IAS auditor, we have to be aware and we have to advise. If we are in practice, we have to advise our customers and our clients of the cyber risks which are out there. We have a responsibility to do so. Some of us, of course, carry out limited information systems audit in conjunction with financial statement audits, right? This is where we do external audit, and in order to express an audit opinion, that is to say that the financial statements present fairly in all material aspects, the financial performance, position and cash flows, etc. of the company, we have to pay attention to the internal controls within systems that are used to generate financial statements. Otherwise, the problem is that the audit risk that we face, that is the risk of expressing an inappropriate audit opinion, is rather high, especially if we are not, if we have not evaluated the internal controls in respect of the financial reporting process, which are embedded in ERP systems. So today, let's now move on to the definition of information systems audit. An IS audit is somewhat, I would say, similar to an internal audit. They both have similar characteristics. For example, according to the Institute of Internal Auditors, an internal audit is defined as an independent and objective assurance or consulting activity. Now, an IS audit also needs to be independent. The function needs to be independent. Those who carry out the information systems audit, whether you are working in an in-house IS audit department, or even if it's an external audit firm where you assist and carry out an IS audit to an external client, you need to ensure that you are independent, right? Independent from self-review threats, familiarity threats, and so on, which we are familiar with as external auditors. So apart from the function being independent, the definition also places emphasis on the fact that the internal auditor needs to be objective. The IS audit also needs to be objective, right? This is an important characteristic that an IS auditor should possess. Objective means you are unbiased. There is no conflict of interest. Your decisions are not influenced by other parties, the management, the directors, and so on. When you develop your audit plans, the audit scope, when you carry out your audit work, when you report your audit findings, you must ensure that your work product is not influenced in any way by anyone, right? Other than your immediate IS audit manager, if you are a subordinate, that is. Now, the definition also goes to talk about two types of audits or assignments. One is assurance in nature, and the other one is consulting in nature, right? So if you are providing an IS audit as part of an assurance engagement where you have to validate and certify the system designs, the internal control system designs, and their operating effectiveness to the board or to shareholders, then of course it's leaning more towards an assurance-based assignment. But if you are providing some sort of advice on IT risk management or how to improve IT governance, etc., then of course it's leaning more towards a consulting service. So either way, right, whichever, whether it's assurance-based or consulting-based, you have to ensure that you ultimately evaluate and improve the effectiveness of GRC meaning governance, risk management, and controls or compliance processes in the organization. So an information systems audit then basically will look at the IT governance, how IT is governed in your organization, as well as how IT risks are managed, right? So these two important areas, if selected in your scope of work, are to be audited, and there are standards that you need to follow to ensure that your work product is of the highest quality. So an information system is basically any system that collects, processes, stores, or disseminates information in digital form, right? So if you look at the definition that is given on the screen, it says here, an IT audit or an information systems audit is the examination and evaluation of the IT infrastructure. When you talk about IT infrastructure, it means the hardware, software, firmware, humanware, all that, right? The applications, be it business applications or support applications. Then the databases. This is where the important concept of data governance comes in. You have to look at the entire data life cycle from the point that you acquire it to the point that you destroy it. Are you securely protecting your data, right? Its entire life cycle from acquisition to disposal. Then you also will look at, as part of the IS audit, it's such a vast area, all policies, procedures, practices related to the governing of information technology in the company. So the definition, when you look at it, it's pretty vast, right? So you need to ensure that you properly draft your IS audit scope when you're agreeing to carry out an IS audit for an organization, because you've got to identify what infrastructure you're going to audit. Is it the servers? Is it the firewalls? Is it the network devices like routers, switches, bridges? Is it the web server? Is it the email server? Is it the proxy server? And if you're looking at applications, what applications are you looking at? Operational applications, then you have financial applications, or it would be one large integrated ERP. You could have all sorts of other support applications. Then data, what are the databases you are going to look at? You have to look at sometimes the configurations related to databases, the security policies, etc. And then an organization, as I said, will have a whole host of policies approved by the board, SOPs approved by the board once again, which we will have to look at, right? The effectiveness of an information systems controls are evaluated in information systems audit. We all know that controls of different types, right? Today, what has happened is, since we live in a digitally driven world, right, where technology can disrupt operations, business operations at any given time, we have to be very mindful of all the internal controls which are embedded in ERP systems, right? These top-notch tier 1, tier 2 ERP systems are based on best practices. And this means that the internal controls which were previously carried out outside the system could possibly be now within the system. And we have to have some sort of means of evaluating these controls. So controls that need to be evaluated in an IS audit can be automated controls, like, as I said, system-based control. They can also be manual controls. There are a lot of tasks which are carried out manually outside of the system. I mean, signing off on a document is a manual control. So there are manual controls also, which will need to be audited as part of the IS audit. And then there are management controls, controls that are carried out by the management, by the directors, and so on. So it doesn't mean that, though we call it IS audit, that we only check controls embedded in systems. We also need to check controls which are around the system, which are manual in nature. And IS audit also aims to establish whether information systems are safeguarding corporate assets, right? Here, of course, when you say corporate assets, it's mainly information other than people are one of the main assets or a competitive advantage that an organization has. So all controls which protect this vital asset needs to be looked at. Then, of course, integrity. You see the word integrity on the slide highlighted and underlined in blue, right? Integrity of data, that is accurate data, reliable data, data which comes to you on time without delay. That is also something that you need to audit carefully when we carry out an IS audit. So what are the, I said at the start that we will look at as to why we carry out IS audits, right? There are different types, but there are essentially 3 questions for which you need to find the answer in an IS audit. And these 3 questions are related to availability, confidentiality, and integrity. What do you mean by availability? Whenever you carry out an IS audit, you have to see, it will be either a system or an application. You have to see whether the organization systems are available for the business when required. Right? There are so many sorts of risks that could prevent an employee or the management or customers from interacting, from carrying out their work, right? For employees, they are unable to access the system is not available, so they cannot carry out certain tasks. Similarly, customers, if you have a web-based interface, e-commerce platform, if your system is not available, then there'll be a business disruption and loss of revenue. So availability is one thing that you need to check in an IS audit, right? So what controls should be there? Now, for example, having a BCP, a disaster recovery plan, is an important control to ensure availability. Having service level agreements with various parties to provide you with continuous service if there's a disruption is an important part of enabling or ensuring that your systems are available when required. The second thing, of course, is related to security and confidentiality of data. This is very important. What this means is that information in the systems must be disclosed only to those who require access, right? Not to others. There must be proper access controls, password management, systems, encryption, multi-factor authentication, and all that. And there are a whole host of controls that you need to, checklists that you need to complete in this area to find the answers, to see whether all the important controls are in place to ensure security and confidentiality. Then the third aspect, of course, is integrity. We all know the system produces various reports, and we should be able to rely upon the contents of these reports, right? The data, the information must be accurate, reliable, and timely. So towards this end, we got to check in an IS audit whether proper controls are in place to ensure accuracy, to ensure reliability, and to ensure timeliness. So all these 3 areas, availability, confidentiality, and integrity, are very important, and you need to think about this when you do an IS audit. So key objectives, all these are overlapping, duplicating. Sometimes I may repeat certain points, but objectives, what do you mean by objectives? Information systems must comply with applicable laws, regulations, or industry guidelines. Now, this is more so in highly regulated industries like banks, finance companies, where you have a regulator issuing directives on maintaining proper IT governance. So you need to read up, depending on the industry that you or your organization is operating in. You must be a little vigilant, do a little research, and find out what are the applicable regulations put out by the regulator in terms of that would impact IT operations. For example, the requirement to have an IT security policy, the requirement to have a data classification policy, the requirement, banks, I think the downtime is 4 hours. They should be able to, in any given disaster, reboot their systems. So if there is a disruption, continue their services within 4 hours. So do they have all the processes in place to ensure that? Right? Then recently you had the data protection bill passed in Parliament. Now, if there is a violation or a disclosure of private confidential data, the highest penalty is 10 million rupees, and it could be compounded for further offences. Right? So you have a data protection bill which may have an impact on your IS audit, right? Then you have to ensure information systems and related processes comply with governance criteria. That is IT governance. Any organization there may be IT governance requirements enforced by maybe the Security Exchange Commission, maybe by the listing rules, maybe through the regulator, and also the company itself, even though there might not be any sort of external requirement. Within the company itself, there may be a certain IT governance framework that is in place based on best practices, right? There are very famous IT governance models. Audit is one of them. Audit was last revised in 2019. So these IT governance models, ISO could be another. These governance models have certain requirements. So when you are going to do an IS audit, it's best that you find out whether the company has adopted some sort of a governance framework. And if so, you have to get that and see, benchmark and identify the gaps. If the company has not adopted an IT governance model, perhaps maybe as a value addition, you could recommend to the company that an IT governance framework be adopted. This is one of the ways in which practitioners can add value to their clients and maybe recommend an IT governance consulting engagement to generate additional revenue. So IS data and information must have appropriate levels of confidentiality and integrity that we spoke about. So I will not touch on that. IS operations must be accomplished efficiently and effectively. So that is about, your day-to-day IT data center operations. Of course, any operation that you do, be it IT or otherwise, you must ensure that it is effective and uses the minimum amount of resources so that the benefits outweigh the costs, right? Any IT project that you embark on, you have to do a business case. There has to be a business case where the positives outweigh the negatives, right? Otherwise, there's no point. It can be a ERP implementation. It can be an implementation of a digital app. It could be implementation of some sort of IT governance framework. It must have a benefit. And all IT-related processes today, to a certain extent, are being automated or digitized, right? And automating a process certainly helps in improving efficiency and productivity. So there are various types of IS audits, right? If you're working in a firm, generally, if you're at the start, you haven't yet established an IS audit service line, you would most likely start off with a general IT controls review. General IT controls review looks at processes around the system, like what the IT organization, the roles and responsibilities, logical access controls, controls related to the server rooms, configuration management, change management, business continuity planning, disaster recovery planning, maybe incident management, so forth. Most of these are independent of specific applications, right? They are generic processes, right, which are applicable to any platform. So a general IT controls review, which I will show you later on, I will show you a few slides specifying what areas they generally cover later on, right? So this is one type of audit that you can do. Another one, so a general IT controls review is generally done in conjunction with the financial statement audit, right? This is of course important because applications do not work in silo, right? The general IT controls play a very important role in the control environment, right? So you have to do a GITC, and if your practice has not carried out such a assignment, you have to now establish at least the capabilities in your firm to set this up. So along with the GITC, the external auditor may also require you to do a limited application controls review. Limited application controls review means now you're going into the application where you're checking the controls related to the inputting of data, to the input of data to the system, the controls related to processing data, the controls related to the output, that is the reports. That's where you go into the system, where you use test data, where you feed in data to the system and see to the input screens and see whether there are any deficiencies in the input screens, or you put data into and process transactions and see whether the data is processing as intended. And you look at the formats of reports to see whether the formats are in proper order and whether the reports get generated and distributed to those who require it, right? So in an external audit, you don't do a full-blown application controls review. You will most likely be interested in focusing on those internal controls specific to the financial reporting process. For example, the creation of the chart of accounts, general ledger accounts and the chart of accounts. You might be interested in looking at journal entries, creation and posting in the system. You might look at controls in suspense accounts, clearing accounts. You might look at use access related to those who are working in the finance department. You might look at the month-end closing process, how the month is closed at month-end so that you cannot go back and post entries. You might also look at various other processes related to the creation of invoices, approval of invoices, credit notes, purchase orders, payments, etc. Anything that could have an impact on the final debit and credit, right? But it's still not a full-blown application controls review. You might look at the GL mapping, right? If you generate a P&L and a balance sheet, how are the individual GL accounts mapped to the balance sheet or to the income statement? If it's not properly mapped, then your balance sheet is not going to be accurate, or your P&L is not going to be accurate. Then again, apart from that, you also have what you would call cybersecurity related audits, where you audit the server configurations, the firewall configurations, right? Proxy server configurations. Then there might be audits related to carrying out what you call internal vulnerability assessments, external vulnerability assessment and penetration tests to see where vulnerabilities lie within your network, right? Apart from that, you could also have audits related to, as I said, IT governance audits, where you look at the governance processes. Then IT security policy reviews, that is also another audit that is sometimes carried out in companies just to see whether the IT policies which are in place, which are documented, cover all the important areas related to the governing of IT in a company, right? Apart from that, what else? You might help the company to maybe carry out an IT risk assessment, right? Today, when you carry out information systems audits or IT audits, you have to ensure that it is risk-based. What do you mean by risk-based? What you mean by risk-based is that when you check the controls in a particular area, you've got to link it to the objectives and risks. So if you are checking IT-related controls, you start with the strategic objectives of the organization. What are they? How are the IT objectives of the Department of IT related to those strategic objectives? You have to do the linking, right? Because the IT objectives must be aligned to the strategic objectives. The IT department carries out its activities to help achieve the strategic objectives of the company. Once you know what the IT objectives are, you have to identify the risks. What are the risks or the risk events that could prevent that organization from achieving its IT objectives or IT goals? So once you identify what these risks are, it could be risks related to anything, right? I'll just give you a few samples of risks. For example, it could be software failures. It could be unauthorized actions. It could be logical attacks, non-compliances, right? It could be related to the IT infrastructure. It could be IT operational infrastructure incidences. It could be acts of nature, right? So all these risks have to be identified. So these IT risks that you identify are linked to your IT objectives, and the IT objectives are linked to the strategic objectives. So once you identify what your IT related risks are, right? It could be a virus, it could be anything. It could be an unauthorized disclosure of data. Once you identify these, then you have to link it to what you call control objectives, right? Control objectives, and then controls. Because why you have controls in place in an organization is to mitigate a risk. So if you do not identify the IT risks or the risks emanating from your IT infrastructure in an organization, there is no way that you can identify what controls need to be there. You can't go into an organization and just say these controls should be there. Let me check whether these controls should be there. What controls should be there can only be identified only once you identify the IT risks or the cyber risks, right? So once these risks are identified, because controls exist to mitigate a risk. That is the basic. So how can you talk about and comfort and give assurance that the organization has proper internal controls in place for, in terms of IT controls, when you haven't even looked at the IT risks? Because controls exist to tackle risks. So strategic objectives, IT risks, and then you come to control objectives and controls, right? So that is the way an IT audit needs to be structured. Everything is risk-based, isn't it? Controls need to identify what controls should be there. We need to identify what risks are there first. What risks is the company exposed to? When we want to find out what areas to audit in IT, we have to, that is also risk-based. Based on risk assessment, we find out what are the most critical IT assets. It could be the server, it could be the firewall. Then we prioritize those. When we have findings in the report, those are also reported, taking into consideration risk. Reporting is also risk-based, isn't it? High risks, medium risks, low risks. So everything is risk-based, and this risk-based theme goes across the entire IT audit cycle, right? So there are two questions here. I can see what additional qualifications to conduct an IT audit. I will get on to that in the very next slide. So as a practitioner, what if you want to set up an IS audit department, what do you need to have? You need to have competent people, right? Competent people, because sometimes what happens is in the smaller firms, not the big ones, in the smaller firms or SMPs, it could be. I myself began my career in a very reputed but smaller firm, and then moved on to a medium scale firm. And then, so there is a tendency sometimes to utilize audit staff on to carry out IT audit work. Now, this is not going to work. Given the advances in technology, you need to have people who are competent in information systems governance, information systems audits. Now, there are various certifications on offer. There is this ISACA, Information Systems Audit and Control Association, which offers various certifications: CISA, CISSP, CGEIT, and you have ICS2 offering CISSP. All these qualifications are important, right? So the best thing is for you to, of course, apart from these professional certifications, you also have your bachelor's degrees and master's degrees in cybersecurity and so on. Those are also very very useful. But whatever said and done, you need to have qualified people doing this, right? Having a qualification itself sometimes is not enough. They need to be skilled, and skill is acquired through experience. So you need to have experienced certification holders to carry out IT audit work. So partners in audit firms need to now, cannot delegate this to junior staff, right? Partners also need to be aware of the risk-based information technology audit methodologies as well. So they need to first educate themselves and become aware of how an IS audit needs to be done. If not, how can you as a partner or a senior person in your firm monitor, oversee, or supervise the work of your juniors? So get yourself first educated, trained, and skilled, and then you can start to hire. So sometimes you can learn from your subordinates as well, but you've got to have some idea to ensure that they are doing their work properly. So IS audit, what other skills do they need? It depends on the area. I mean, it's preferable if an IS auditor has a background in finance as well. Because at the end of the day, you and I, we all know, without a knowledge in debits and credits, we cannot really study IT controls. We need to know the business logic. We need to know what the debit entries and credit entries. And with that knowledge, if we have a little bit of an idea of how to do an IS audit, then especially when it comes to an application controls review, it will be very useful. A little bit of background in finance, definitely a proper understanding in IT infrastructure, and just a degree in IT would not be enough. You need to know how to do an IT audit. So you need to know, it's like for us, we need to know about the Sri Lanka auditing standards. In IT also there are IT auditing standards. You need to have someone who is familiar with these standards, right? Sometimes for reviewing of a BCP, you can have BCP specialists. There are qualifications in that area as well, right? So someone very knowledgeable in IT governance, in IT auditing, right? So certifications which focus on these areas would be useful. And maintaining technical competence also is a must. This is, of course, a CPD, we call it CPD. And we have to constantly update our knowledge on the latest developments, because as I said, the cybersecurity threat landscape is evolving day by day, right? Companies are today using AI and they are also using big data, and you need to be able to tell them as a practitioner, these are the risks you face because you are using these new technologies. This is a value add that you can give, right? Because we need to now evolve to the stage where we not only provide general IT control reviews or limited application reviews, we must move to the phase where as IS auditors, we can also provide, we can develop IS security policies for a company. We should be able to carry out penetration tests, internal vulnerability assessments, audits of server, firewall configurations, all that is important. So you need to have people who have actually done this. I mean, you can't come to a firm and learn this. You can learn it as a junior, but you need to have someone who has done it to guide that person. And for this, of course, you have to make a decent investment in your human resources. So members of professional bodies, certification holders are the best, right? Because we all know that when you're a member of a professional body, one of the fundamental pillars of any code of ethics is competence, right? And competence requires you to carry out your work according to standards. So if you have someone who carries a certification and they carry out an internal audit, an IS audit, you can be rest assured that they will carry it out according to the standards, right? So these are requirement. If I'm an external auditor in Sri Lanka, I have to carry out my external audit according to the auditing standards. That's a requirement. So wouldn't it be better for you to have someone in your organization, in your practice, someone who is bound by that sort of thing, where they are members and they have to follow the code of ethics. And in the code of ethics, there's a requirement that they be competent, they exercise due diligence and be professional in carrying out their work. And this is a requirement. So you can ensure, so this will spill over to the quality of their work. It's a behavioral and technical necessity that they follow standards, and they keep themselves, if you look at point 4, they have to keep themselves updated, abreast of the latest technology developments that are taking place. It's a requirement. So you need to have people, competent people who will stay competent through continuous education, and this will help you to better serve your clients. Otherwise, if you're going to use a bunch of external auditors or internal auditors to also carry out this work, the quality may be impaired, right? The quality may be impaired. So you need to identify the good ones and maybe get them trained on IT audit, or hire and recruit IT auditors from the outside. So IS control objectives, right? When IT audits are carried out, IT audits are carried out, we have to check IT related controls. So what are these control objectives? These are the desired results. These are the desired results. This is why we carry out. If you have an IT department and they carry out various activities, they carry it out to achieve the IT objectives. Now, to achieve IT objectives, you have to have controls in place, right? Without controlling, you cannot ensure that the staff carry out their work, meet that objective, that they will ensure they will meet that objective, right? So to do that, you have to ensure that the screen is suddenly, it has become purple. So do you also see that, or let me just...
Yeah, Shane, yeah.
Looks like a movie, you know. So let me just switch off and switch on. Right, right. For a moment, I thought I was a superhero, you know, in one of these movies with a purple filter. Anyway, let's go on. So you have to find out what these IS control objectives. Controls are in place to achieve certain objectives related to maybe availability, integrity, confidentiality. What are these control objectives? Now, controls are there to achieve these objectives, right? And controls can be in the form of policies, procedures, practices, and structures. So what are the policies in place in an organization? If you look at a board-approved policy, these are all tell the documents controls, things that are needed to be done to monitor. It could be reporting requirements, it could be a new approval structure, documentation requirements, monitoring requirements. So the policies, procedures, practices, and structures need to be looked at by you in an IS audit, right? This is very, very important. Let's move on. So these are also some of the control objectives. Control objectives are there to safeguard assets. If you are developing bespoke or programs inside your organization, within the organization, there must be proper processes and policies established to do that with proper sign-offs and use acceptance testing. Then you have operating systems. So you have to look and see what controls should be there to ensure the integrity of your operating system environments, right? You cannot use outdated operating systems. You cannot use unpatched operating systems. They need to be supported by the vendor. Then you have to look at your sensitive and critical applications and what controls need to be in place to ensure that they remain, that their integrity is ensured. Then you also have to ensure that there is a proper user identification and authentication process in the company, where resources are given access to based on a need to do or for example, no basis. Then you need to look at another control objective is ensuring the efficiency and effectiveness of operations, integrity and reliability of the change management. We all know that software need frequent changes. So what controls are there in place to ensure that all these changes are properly monitored and authorized. So then you need to check for compliance with various laws, regulations, SOPs, etc. So what controls are there to ensure that the organization checks periodically to see that these requirements are complied with. Then you have various services provided. All these services must be provided continuously. So that's where you look at BCPs and DRPs. Then you have to protect your data, right, from attacks, from unauthorized disclosures. You need to have perhaps encryption, logical access controls, multi-factor authentication, then end user device security mechanisms in place. Then you need to have incident response plans. If someone tries to log into the system 3 times or 4 times, then that person is locked out. And you need to also check some processes in your organization could be outsourced, right? Could be outsourced. So what are those processes? And you need to have proper service level agreements to monitor those. So what is the standard that is used? Earlier I told you when an IS audit is done, you have to do it according to a certain standard. This standard is called, it's a framework, IT assurance framework. And this framework has been published by ISACA, right? You can Google it. And in this framework, you have various standards, guidelines, tools, and techniques. Now, if you follow this framework, right? If you follow this framework will ensure that the IS Audit Department, the roles, responsibilities are properly defined. It will tell you what knowledge and skills are required. It will tell you how the audit needs to be done and how the reports need to be prepared. It will also give you various definitions in the glossary, terms and concepts specific to IS assurance, and provide a whole host of tools and techniques, maybe for data analytics or something else, which could be useful. So all this guidance is available. As you can see, the standards and guidelines, here you have the general standards. They tell you how to, they talk about independence, how the IS audit function needs to be independent, how the IS auditor needs to be objective, how you need to exercise due care and competence when you carry out an audit. Then there are performance-related standards which look at or provide guidance on how to conduct the audit, how to plan, how to supervise, how to prepare your scope, how to mobilize resources, etc. And then there are reporting standards also. Reporting standards will talk about the reports, the contents of the reports, how it needs to be communicated, either orally or verbally or in written form, how you need to structure the report. So there is a lot of guidance available out there which you need to make use of, right? So these are the names of those standards. These are the names. Here you have a standard on the audit charter, independence, ethics standards, competence. And then there's a standard on planning, how to perform the audit work, reporting, like that. You have standards for various areas. If you take the planning standard, for example, that will tell you how to plan and the IS audit coverage. It will also tell you how to develop and document risk-based audit approach, how to develop an audit plan, how to develop an audit program. Right? So guidance is available. You just have to reach out for it. Performance of audit work, how the IS audits should be supervised, how you should collect the evidence, and also the documentation requirements. So we can skip this. You can, in the interest of time, I will skip that. So these are some of the types of IS audits that are there. You can do IT general control audits, system and application audits, technology position audits. This looks at your technology footprint, right? What technologies do you use in your business, which are critical? And then you can identify whether those technologies are base, key pacing, or emerging technologies, right? Then IT infrastructure audits, where you look at your IT hardware, servers, etc., and see whether they have sufficient capacity to be used for the next few years, right? And you identify gaps and see what requires to be replaced. Cybersecurity audits are also there. So developing an IT audit plan, of course, the main framework that IS auditors use is the COBIT 2019 framework. This is a very important framework. The COBIT framework is the base, the foundation framework for IT auditors. Now, for internal auditors, you have a framework called the ITPF, the International Professional Practices Framework. And for IT auditors, it is the COVID framework. So you need to familiarize yourself with the contents of this framework. And if you look at this framework, it talks about how you can, the methodology that you should follow for developing an IT audit, a risk-based IT audit plan, right? How you need to understand your enterprise strategy. It starts with the organization strategy, where you need to start get a proper understanding of the strategy. What are the strategic goals of the organization? And then you find, identify what are the risks that are there which would prevent the organization from reaching those strategic goals. And you have to understand any other information and technology related risks that the organization is facing. The second phase involves identifying all the IT audit areas that you need to audit. Then you have to carry out a risk assessment to prioritize those areas that you have identified. And then you end up with an IT audit plan. So these are the areas that you need to be familiar with when you're carrying out an IT audit. You can't just go to an organization and just do all your work in the IT Audit Department. You have to start with a good understanding of the strategic plan of the organization, the strategic goals, the risk profile, the threat landscape. What are the new threats that are out there which could affect the IT infrastructure, compliance requirements, as I said, internally as well as externally, the role of IT, whether the IT plays a significant role in the organization, whether the company is driven by IT or just a support function. The sourcing model for IT, that is also important because certain services are now outsourced. You might be using cloud services. So in such case, those services need to be risk assessed before you deploy them. And there must be constant monitoring. You need to get periodical audit reports by the cloud service provider, and then service level terms and conditions must be properly defined. IT implementation methods, technology adoption strategy. Of course, if you are what you call a early adopter of technology, then the risks are greater because you will be one of the first to adopt certain technologies in your business. So if that is the case, you have to be a little more careful in terms of ensuring that all cyber risks are identified. Then enterprise size is also important because if the company is small, then it might be a little difficult for you to implement what you call segregation of duties. So there is a note on this. I can share this presentation with you later on. So these are the areas that we need to be covered in an IS audit. You have to cover all processes, right? All processes which are related to your managing your IT. Organizational structures in the company, right? Not only in the IT department, but also you've got to see, you've got to look at how IT is governed in an organization, starting from the board of directors. Then all principles, policies, procedures, what is in there, and you can take that and identify what should be audited. Information, of course, is enterprise-wide, and information is one of the most important corporate assets. And apart from information and reports stemming from the IT department, all other information that are used by various departments, you've got to check the integrity and accuracy and so on. The culture, ethics, behavior is a very important part of the control environment, right? There are culture audits that can be done these days. So that is also important because you can have the best of internal controls or IS controls. It's of no use if the tone at the top is all wrong. The people skills and competence is also important. You need to have properly trained people to do this. If you recruit incompetent people, if you promote incompetent people, if you do not properly carry out performance appraisals and ensure that the proper competent people are retained and given the key positions, you can have the best controls, but they'll be rendered ineffective. Then what are the services and infrastructure and applications that need to be audited? So all these areas that you see on the left side, governance system components. Under all these areas, you will have various, what you call sub areas that could come within the scope of audit, right? And then at the end, you have to determine based on the frequency, you have to analyze. Can you remember I said that you have to prioritize which areas to be done first. So here, the only way to prioritize is you have to do a risk assessment, and risk assessments are normally done in terms of frequency. That is, if the risk realizes, what would be the impact to the organization? That is the impact, and frequency is how likely is it to happen, right? How likely is it that the risk may realize? So based on frequency assessment and impact assessment, you can identify which areas you need to audit in the audit universe. The audit universe being all services, all infrastructure, devices, servers, all applications. Then a people competency audit, a culture audit, then an information or data governance audit, a review of all principles, policies, procedures, a review of the IT organizational structure and the processes. Now in IT, there are lots of processes such as acquisition of IT software, acquisition of hardware, monitoring this. If you look at the COVID 2019 framework, that lists all the important processes that should be there in an organization. So those processes are the ones that need to be picked up in your IS audit. I think the time is 4:30. So GITC, these are some of the areas that we do a ITGC, information technology, general controls review. These are the areas that we look at. We look at the IT structure. For that, we have to request documents, the structural diagram and the job descriptions from the client. We look at the systems that they use, the policies. We see whether the users are aware of those policies, then the BCP DR plans, BCP test reports, physical access controls to server rooms, all that, IT asset registers, software, hardware, list of licensed software, then patch updates and all are done. Incident management, there are areas to be covered under that ITGC service level agreements, non-disclosure agreements, antivirus controls, then the creation and deactivation of new users and those who have left the organization, password controls, right? Change management, backup procedures, super-user control. Super-users are those who are administrators in the company, right, who have privileged access. So with that, I will just conclude my presentation, as we have to leave about 15 minutes for any questions and answer questions that you may have. Gurad, you can take over.
Yeah, Ashane, thank you very much, Ashane. It was a very comprehensive session, starting from the background of IS audit and also the standard practices, guidelines, and the type of IS audit and how you conduct. I think more importantly, the most important part, which I like, you have gone through to the level of giving enough insights to the practitioners who are interested in studying on this area. They know now what to look at. So that is very important. With the interest of time, I will have a few questions. I'll first take the question which I have from a business point of view. I believe our practitioners will like to find some answers for that question also. Ashane, you mentioned about the types of audits and the expertise knowledge that the practitioners should have in conducting those audits. There are two challenges in most of the SMPs, whether they have this expertise in-house, and the question is, if not, whether they can have that investment coming in, like recruiting a permanent IT expert person and pay monthly, which could be a kind of investment for them. And having that into consideration, my first question, Ashane, how best they can find ways and means to ensure that they have relevant expertise around, and also what are the strategies they can use in creating opportunities that client may have, which beneficial to the SMPs.
So on getting competent staff on board to carry out this sort of service, I think there are many strategies you can adopt. One, of course, is if the practice does not have any sort of experience in carrying out IS audits, you need to recruit someone. You have to, if internally no one is there, you have to look external. And you have to identify what sort of skills. As I said, a practitioner initially would want to be able to carry out a GITC and an application controls review. I mean, carrying out internal vulnerability assessments, external vulnerability assessments, penetration tests. That is more serious stuff, right? But at least at a minimum, if you want to do a GITC application controls review, you need to recruit someone who has done it elsewhere, right? Because it's somewhat, so you need to recruit someone initially. Once you recruit that person, you need to get the others trained on it, and then you can slowly expand. I mean, you have good finance auditors who can learn some of it, right? Because they have the business logic. They know what the debits and credits are and the financial processes. So you can, through training, by sending the staff for workshops, seminars on how to do a GITC and equipping them with the required knowledge on IT governance, you can develop in-house to a certain extent, certain competencies which may be useful to the practitioner. But my advice is to ideally to recruit someone or work with a consultant. If you cannot recruit someone full-time, at least on a case-by-case basis for 1 or 2 assignments, get a consultant on board and learn from them, put a few staff under them, learn from them, and then later on, once your staff get trained, then you can perhaps do a few audits on your own. Of course, this is the GITC or in the application controls review area, but if it's related to, of course, a penetration test or vulnerability assessments, or development of IS security plans or policies, this is, of course, you need experienced individuals to do that sort of thing. What was your second question? Of course, okay, your second question was related to how can firms perhaps generate additional revenue and identify new opportunities. Yes, as you know, most companies today prepare their financials on accounting software. And this software, you need to get it audited, right? You cannot it's very difficult, I would say, to give an audit opinion if the controls in the system have not been looked at or audited. So you need to generate business opportunities that way. You need to go out to your clients and say, we are expressing an opinion on a set of financials generated by this package, but we have never looked at the application level controls. So can we do one? Of course, we have to look at the conflicts of the dependence requirements and all that. Then most companies today do not have written documented IS security policies. This is also another area where you can go into and recommend that you develop IS security policies for them. So you need to go out there and get a few IS security policies and customize it to the customers, because at the initial stage, most of these policies will be simple, right? They wouldn't be very complicated. And perhaps this first phase of policies, you will be able to prepare it. Another assignment that you can do is you can develop BCPs for companies, DRPs, right? Or you can look at the IT governance model that is used in the company, where, for example, the directors today have to think about IT governance as part of corporate governance, right? IT is a very important subset of corporate governance. So does the board on their agenda, is that an agenda item on the board? Do they look at cybersecurity risks, etc.? So these are areas that they need to highlight to the management, and then perhaps if they have the competency, they can do it themselves.
Right. Thank you, Ashwin. That's comprehensive insights. We got 2 more theoretical questions to take up. One question asks whether we need to perform IS audit for all audits, whether there's a kind of a scoping required, or whether there are any exceptions. I think that's the question asking.
Whether I didn't hear the question correctly, whether there is a requirement for?
Whether they need to perform IS audit for every engagement, every audit engagement.
No, not required. I think GITC needs to be done, right? Plus limited application controls need to be done. So you have to decide for yourself. I mean, if you are an audit partner and you are giving an audit opinion, can you give that audit opinion with confidence? If the controls in the system have not been validated at all, right? I mean, certain controls you can manually check through system reports, etc. You can check to a certain extent as part of your normal external audit procedures, but there is certain processing happening inside systems, within systems, for which you need to put test data and check if the processing is happening as intended. So for that sort of thing, I think a limited application controls review may be required, being limited to the financial reporting process. So there is another question, Gerard. Was there a special certification by CA Sri Lanka? Yes, there is a diploma that is being offered in information systems audit. It's called DISCA, and every year I think they have it. It's a virtual program, 5-day program. So that is a good starting point for those who are keen on learning about information systems audits.
I think a participant, you can reach out CS Sri Lanka and get more information on that. Basically, I think that's all we have for today, Ashane, from
right.
Very much again for your comprehensive session. Niroshi, over to you to wrap up the session.
So on behalf of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Sri Lanka and Member Relations Committee, we would like to thank you, our speaker today, Mr. Jayasekara and Mr. Gerard Dias, for moderating this session. And we would like to thank you all for participating in this webinar. Actually, it's very interactive and very effective webinar. So thank you, everyone. Stay safe.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.